Hello everyone. Welcome to Realist Quill. Like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching now? I used to believe the worst thing that could happen at sea was drowning. 5 years working as a cruise ship attendant taught me there are far worse fates waiting in international waters, where jurisdiction gets murky and people can disappear without a trace. My name is Eliza, and this is my story for Realist Quill about how I almost became another statistic. The Mediterranean route was always my favorite. 8 months into my contract with Oceanic Star Cruises, I was assigned to their flagship vessel hosting primarily wealthy European and American tourists. The pay was decent, the crew quarters cramped but tolerable, and the ports exotic enough to make the grueling hours worthwhile. I had friends among the staff, mostly other Filipinos, Indonesians, and Eastern Europeans, who, like me, sent most of our earnings home to family. Marius was different. Romanian, early 30s, worked in guest relations, always impeccably dressed with this disarming smile that made even the most difficult passengers calm down. Management loved him. He had this way of fixing problems before they escalated. I noticed him watching me during crew meetings, always finding reasons to pass by my station during shifts. When he finally asked me to join him for coffee during our port stop in Athens, it felt flattering. Over the next 3 weeks, Marius and I grew closer. He knew all the hidden spots in each port where crew could enjoy a few hours away from tourists. He listened when I talked about my family, about my dreams of opening a small business back home after saving enough. He seemed to genuinely care. When he mentioned his connections to management and hinted he could help me secure a higher paying position on one of their luxury vessels, I was intrigued but not immediately suspicious. The selection process is different, he explained one night as we sat on deck watching the stars. More discreet. They need to evaluate candidates away from the main crew. The opportunity came during our Naples stop. Marius said a hiring executive would be in port for just 1 day, willing to interview me at a hotel near the marina. I'd need to bring my passport, credentials, and be prepared for an immediate transfer if selected. It meant potentially doubling my salary. I told my supervisor I had a family emergency and needed a few hours ashore. The hotel wasn't what I expected. Not the luxurious establishment you'd associate with cruise executives, but a rundown place in a less reputable part of town. Still, I reasoned, perhaps discretion was the point. When I arrived at the room number Marius had given me, a middle-aged Italian man opened the door. No introductions, no pleasantries. He just gestured for me to enter. Inside were 2 more men. No one looked like cruise line manager. No paperwork, no company logos. Nothing professional about the setup. Just 3 men in a hotel room eyeing me like merchandise. One was on the phone speaking rapid Italian, and though I couldn't understand the words, I caught numbers being discussed. Prices. Where's Marius? I asked, clutching my bag closer. He said there would be an interview. The man nearest the door laughed. Marius has been paid. You won't be seeing him again. My stomach dropped as they explained my new position. I would be working in a private club in Eastern Europe. My debt for recruitment and transportation would take years to pay off. My passport would be held for safekeeping. They already had copies of all my information from the cruise line's records. My home address, my family contacts, everything needed to threaten compliance. I've never considered myself particularly brave or resourceful. I was just an ordinary woman who'd walked into a trap. But something primal takes over when you realize you're moments away from disappearing forever. While they discussed logistics in Italian, I inched toward the bathroom, asking if I could freshen up before the transfer. Surprisingly, they allowed it, probably assuming I was resigned to my fate or too frightened to act. In the bathroom, I had perhaps 2 minutes before they'd get suspicious. No window, no weapon. Just my phone, which still had service in port. I texted my location to both my closest crew friend and, in desperation, the official cruise security number we were given for emergencies, adding trafficking emergency. 3 men holding me. sent by Marius from crew. Then I flushed the toilet, ran the sink, and walked back out with what I hoped looked like defeated acceptance. I asked for water, trying to buy time. One man went to get some from a mini fridge across the room. The others continued discussing transportation details. 20 excruciating minutes passed as I made up questions about this club I'd be working at, pretending to accept my fate while watching the door, praying someone had taken my text seriously. When the pounding on the door came, the men initially seemed merely annoyed at the interruption. Then came the shouted identifications: Italian police, cruise security. The room erupted into chaos. One man grabbed me as a shield. Another went for what I now saw was a gun tucked in his waistband. The third tried to escape through the bathroom as if a window might magically have appeared. What followed was a blur of shouting, violence, and confusion. I remember being thrown to the floor, a knee pressing into my back that I later learned belonged to an officer who mistook me for an accomplice in the initial confusion. I remember the taste of carpet fibers and dust as I pressed my face down, trying to make myself as small a target as possible while gunshots, actual gunshots, echoed in that small hotel room. When it was over, 2 traffickers were in custody. One had escaped, presumably through a service area connected to the bathroom, and I learned how close I'd come to vanishing. A van was waiting behind the hotel, scheduled to transport me and 2 other women across the border within the hour. The club was actually a series of brothels across Eastern Europe, where women like me, foreign, isolated, without language skills or local connections, were kept in debt bondage, often drugged into compliance. The investigation revealed the horrifying scale of the operation. Marius wasn't just a recruiter. He was a key coordinator who had worked on 3 different cruise lines over 6 years. He targeted crew members, usually women from developing countries working to support families back home, women whose disappearances might be noticed later than tourists, women whose families lacked resources to mount international searching. 17 women from my cruise line alone had resigned during port stops over the past 3 years. 11 remained missing. 6 had been recovered in police raids, some after more than 2 years in captivity, and Marius had helped select every one of them. The cruise line, of course, denied any knowledge. Their security team cooperated with authorities but maintained that Marius had passed all background checks. They offered counseling, paid leave, and eventually a different assignment. But I couldn't go back to ships, couldn't trust the confined space, the international waters, the knowledge that another Marius might be watching, evaluating, selecting. The most haunting part wasn't the near miss with Trafficker. It was returning to the ship afterward, to collect my things and seeing Marius's friend Stefan watching me from across the crew area. He'd been Marius's roommate, always friendly, always attentive to which crew members might be vulnerable, might be lured by promises of better opportunity. When our eyes met, he didn't look surprised or concerned that I'd returned. He looked disappointed, as if I'd failed some test. And I realized then that Marius wasn't a lone predator. He was part of a network that remained intact, even with him in custody. I quit that day. Left behind half my belongings just to get off that ship faster. I later testified via video, rather than risk returning to Italy, where the trial was held. Marius was sentenced to 12 years. 2 traffickers received similar sentences. One was never found. Stefan continued working on cruise ships for another year before disappearing himself, whether to escape scrutiny or to continue operations elsewhere. I don't know. 5 years later, I still check the exits whenever I enter a room. I still sleep with my passport and phone within reach. And I can't look at cruise advertisements without wondering how many women are being watched right now by someone like Marius. Someone charming, attentive, and patient. Waiting for the perfect moment to make an introduction that ends with a disappearance. I share this story through REALIST QUILL as a warning. Trafficking doesn't always begin with kidnapping or force. Sometimes it starts with an opportunity, a friendship, a romance. Sometimes the trap is so carefully laid that you're already inside it before you recognize the danger. And sometimes the people who seem most trustworthy are the ones who've perfected the art of selecting victims no one will look for until it's too late. I was 32 years old, halfway through my doctoral program in cultural anthropology when I decided to conduct field research in Moldova for my dissertation on post-Soviet economic transitions. My professors warned me about the challenges, language barriers, bureaucratic obstacles, limited academic resources, but no one warned me about Roman. No one could have. This is my story for Realist Quill, about how academic pursuit nearly turned me into property. I'd spent months securing approvals, grants, and contacts before arriving in Chisinau in early autumn. The university there had assigned Roman as my local liaison, a professor of economics with perfect English, who seemed genuinely interested in my research. He helped arrange interviews, translated documents, navigated bureaucracy, and gradually became both colleague and friend. 3 months into my stay, Roman mentioned a unique opportunity, a regional economic forum in Transnistria, the unrecognized breakaway state along Moldova's eastern border. Several oligarchs and business leaders would be attending, people normally inaccessible to Western researchers. As my research focused on underground economies and labor migration, this seemed invaluable. When Roman offered to handle the complicated permit process to enter Transnistria and accompany me as translator, I was grateful. "You'll need to leave your passport with the border authorities," he explained as we drove toward the checkpoint. "Standard procedure. I'll keep mine as I'm a registered guide. Don't worry, I've done this dozens of times with researchers." The checkpoint was tense. Armed guards examined our documents closely. I surrendered my passport as instructed, receiving a paper entry permit in return. Roman spoke with the guards in Russian, and though I'd learned some basics, they spoke too rapidly for me to follow. One guard kept looking at me, then back at Roman, before finally waving us through with what seemed like a knowing nod. The economic forum was at a compound outside Tiraspol. As we approached, I noticed security cameras, armed guards, and high walls, excessive even by Eastern European standards. Inside, rather than the academic or business setting I expected, we entered what appeared to be a luxury villa. No conference tables, no other researcher, just well-dressed men drinking and conducting hushed conversations in various languages. "Where are the presentations?" I whispered to Roman. "The other academics. Later," he assured me. "First, these men want to meet you privately, very interested in your Western perspective." A heavy-set man approached us, speaking Russian to Roman while eyeing me appraisingly. The conversation grew tense. I caught words like American, price, and paperwork. Roman's demeanor changed completely. Gone was the supportive colleague, replaced by a hard-eyed businessman. That's when I realized with sickening clarity, there was no economic forum. The merchandise under discussion was me. "Your visa situation is complicated now," Roman explained afterward, dropping all pretense. "Border control has your passport. Officially, you're not in Transnistria. You're nowhere. These men have invested in bringing you here. You'll entertain them and their associates. Behave well, and maybe in a year or two you can earn back your freedom." I was shown to a room upstairs, comfortable, but with a lock on the outside. Through the window, I could see more guards than before. My phone had no service. Transnistria uses different telecommunications networks specifically to isolate from Moldova proper. The bathroom had no razor, no glass, nothing that could serve as a weapon or tool. They'd planned for resistance. That night, I heard other women's voices in adjacent rooms, some speaking Russian, one possibly Mandarin, another with an accent I thought might be Brazilian. This wasn't just about me. This compound was a node in a larger network. For 3 days, I played along, feigning fascination with the men introduced to me, accepting drinks, but secretly disposing of them, when possible, maintaining the fiction that I was flattered by the attention while looking for any opportunity. I learned the compound's rhythms. Guards changed at midnight and 6 a.m. Food came at regular intervals. Some staff were local Transnistrians who seemed uncomfortable with the operation but too frightened or poor to object. My opportunity came during a power outage, common in Transnistria with its aging Soviet infrastructure. The backup generator kicked in, but for approximately 40 seconds, the electronic locks disengaged. I'd already prepared, studying the grounds from my window, noting the service entrance where food deliveries arrived, memorizing faces of guards who seemed less vigilant. When the lights went out, I moved immediately, slipping out, navigating by moonlight through hallways I'd mentally mapped, using the confusion to blend with staff rushing to check systems. I made it to the kitchen, grabbed a delivery jacket hanging by the door, and walked out with purpose during the generator startup sequence when everyone was distracted. The perimeter still had guards, but I'd noticed one who routinely stepped away for cigarettes near the service gate. I timed my approach to coincide with his break, kept my head down, muttered something about forgotten supplies in the delivery van, and somehow through luck or desperation made it past the gate. I had no passport, no phone, no money, and was in a breakaway state not recognized by any major nation, where Moldovan authorities had no jurisdiction. I walked for hours along dark roads, avoiding headlights, eventually reaching a small village where an elderly woman took pity on me. She didn't understand English, but grasped enough to hide me in her root cellar when cars came searching that night. The next morning, her teenage grandson arrived and miraculously spoke some English from online gaming. I explained I was an American in trouble, needed to reach the Moldovan border. Rather than helping directly, he called his school teacher, who contacted a local priest who had connections across the border. This chain of ordinary people, risking their own safety, created an underground railroad that eventually smuggled me back across the Transnistrian border. 3 days later, Moldovan authorities were initially suspicious. An American without documents, with a wild story about trafficking. It took calls to my university, the American embassy, and eventually dental records to establish my identity. The investigation afterward revealed fragments of a sophisticated operation. Roman had been recruiting for years, primarily targeting academic women researchers, journalists, aid workers, whose work provided plausible reason to visit remote areas where they could disappear. The compound in Transnistria was one of several evaluation centers where women were held before being moved to more permanent locations across Eastern Europe and the Middle East. My academic credentials and American citizenship had marked me as high-value merchandise, destined for a wealthy collector in the Gulf states, who specifically requested educated Western women as companions. Roman was eventually arrested trying to cross into Ukraine, but the network behind him proved elusive. Transnistria's unrecognized status created the perfect jurisdictional black hole for such operations. No international law enforcement could operate there effectively, and local authorities were either complicit or powerless. The most haunting aspect wasn't the trafficking attempt itself, but how meticulously it had been planned. Roman had spent 3 months gaining my trust, learning my habits, assessing my vulnerabilities. He'd read my research, engaged intellectually, created exactly the academic relationship I needed. The person I'd considered a friend and colleague had actually been evaluating me as merchandise from our first meeting. I never finished my dissertation. Couldn't bear to look at the research that had nearly cost my freedom. Instead, I've spent the last 7 years working with anti-trafficking organizations, focusing specifically on academic and professional women targeted through their work. We've identified similar operations targeting researchers in parts of Central Asia, the Caucasus, and certain regions of Africa where governance is weak and borders porous. The tactics evolve, but the pattern remains consistent. Find educated women whose work requires travel to isolated areas, offer indispensable local assistance, establish trust over months, then manufacture a situation requiring entry into a controlled area, where documentation can be confiscated and jurisdiction becomes ambiguous. I tell this story through Realist Quill, because somewhere right now, Another researcher, journalist, or aid worker is trusting their local contact absolutely. They're planning to visit a region where their passport might be the only proof they exist. They're believing that their education, their nationality, their professional status somehow protects them from becoming merchandise. I was that person once. The cost of that naivety is a price no one should have to pay. When I was 22, I signed up with an international agency to become an au pair in America. Growing up in rural Brazil, this seemed like the perfect opportunity. Improve my English, experience another culture, save money for university back home. All while living with a host family who would treat me like one of their own. At least, that's what the brochures promised. This is my story for Realist Quill about how a legitimate cultural exchange program became my pathway into exploitation, and the complicated escape that followed. The matching process was extensive. Video interviews, background checks, medical exams, and pages of questionnaires about everything from my childcare philosophy to food allergies. I was matched with the Watkins family in Connecticut. Michael, a financial consultant who traveled frequently. Rebecca, who ran a small interior design business from home, and their children Tyler and Madison, ages 8 and 5. They seemed perfect on paper, and during our video call, upper middle class, spacious home in a safe neighborhood, experienced with hosting au pairs, glowing references from previous girls who had lived with them. Rebecca emphasized how they considered au pairs part of the family, showing me photos of family vacations where previous au pairs were included. My first red flag should have been at the airport. Instead of the whole family, only Michael came to pick me up. He explained that Rebecca had a client emergency, and the kids were at activities. During the hour-long drive to their home, his questions felt oddly personal about my family's financial situation. Whether anyone back home depended on my income, if I had a boyfriend who would visit. The house was exactly as pictured in their profile, colonial style, well-appointed, with a comfortable au pair suite in the finished basement. But Rebecca wasn't warm like in our video call. She gave a perfunctory tour, reviewed a printed schedule of duties, and mentioned that we run a tight ship here. The children seemed subdued, nothing like the laughing kids from the photos. By the end of my first week, the cultural exchange part of being an au pair had evaporated. My schedule expanded from the contractual 45 hours to nearly 70, including weekends. My phone plan, which the family was supposed to provide, was restricted to limited data and monitored call. When I mentioned contacting the agency about the hours, Michael casually mentioned that violating their house rules could result in immediate program termination and visa cancellation. The last girl complained to the agency, Rebecca told me one evening. We had her sent back to Colombia within 48 hours. Her family had already spent their placement fee on home renovations. Such a shame. The message was clear: compliance or consequences. Over the following months, my world shrank to the Watkins home and the children's activity. I wasn't allowed to use the family car independently. My stipend was deposited into an account Michael had helped set up, which I later discovered I couldn't access without his approval. The promised language classes never materialized because the schedule was too Other restrictions accumulated gradually. No visitors, no weekend trips without permission. Cameras inside the house for the children's safety that seemed to track my movements. Required check-ins when the family was traveling. Confiscated passport for safekeeping in the home safe. I wasn't the stereotypical trafficking victim being moved across borders in the back of a truck. I had entered the country legally, lived in an affluent neighborhood, cared for children who attended private school, but I had become a modern indentured servant, isolated, financially dependent, and afraid of deportation consequences that would devastate my family back home, who now relied on even my meager stipend. The turning point came 9 months in when I developed a severe kidney infection, but wasn't allowed to miss work to see a doctor until I collapsed while making dinner. At the hospital, a Portuguese-speaking nurse noticed my hesitation when she asked about my living situation. She slipped me her phone number, whispering that I could call her anytime. 3 weeks later, I found evidence that disturbed me deeply. While cleaning Michael's home office, I discovered a folder containing detailed files on 5 previous au pairs, far more than the 2 they had mentioned. Each file contained copies of passports, bank statements, family photos from their home countries, and disturbing notes evaluating their compliance,
isolation risk, and financial pressure points. My own file was there too, thicker than the other.
That night, I used Madison's tablet and a hidden Wi-Fi network I'd discovered to contact the nurse. She connected me with a labor trafficking advocate who explained my situation plainly. The Watkins were experienced exploiters who specifically targeted au pairs from countries with unstable economies and strong family obligations. They operated within technical legality while violating every principle of the program, carefully selecting victims who would endure exploitation rather than risk returning home in disgrace. My escape had to be methodical. For 6 weeks I gathered evidence, photos of schedules proving hour violations, recordings of threats, copies of bank statements showing financial control. I created a dedicated email account, uploading everything to a secure folder. I located my passport during a rare afternoon alone in the house. I connected with a network of former au pairs who had experienced similar situations. The day I left was ordinary by design. I did morning school drop-offs, then instead of returning to the house, I met the advocate at a predetermined location. We went directly to the au pair agency's regional office with my evidence, then to the police station to document the labor violation. By evening, I was in temporary housing arranged by a trafficking survivors organization. The aftermath revealed the sophistication of the Watkins operation. They had hosted 14 au pairs over 8 years, cycling through different agencies when one became suspicious. They specifically selected girls from countries experiencing economic hardship, often with single mothers or siblings needing financial support. They had cultivated relationships with particular agency representatives who would look the other way for the right incentive. Most disturbingly, they weren't alone. They belonged to a network of families across 3 states who shared strategies for maintaining control over their au pairs. Everything from visa threats to surveillance techniques. They exchanged notes on which countries produced the most compliant girls and how to identify candidates with the highest financial pressure to endure exploitation. The legal aftermath was frustratingly anticlimactic. The Watkins received fines for labor violations and were banned from the au pair program, but faced no criminal charges. The system wasn't designed to recognize this form of trafficking. No locked doors, no physical abuse, just psychological coercion and systematic isolation wrapped in the veneer of cultural exchange. I was luckier than most. I received a special visa to remain in the United States as a trafficking victim, completed my education, and now work with international organizations to reform au pair programs globally. Many others remain trapped, working in beautiful homes in affluent neighborhoods, invisible prisoners of families who understand exactly how to exploit immigration vulnerabilities and economic necessity. This is why I share my story through Realist Quill, because trafficking doesn't always wear the face we expect. Sometimes it looks like a smiling family in a Christmas card photo. Sometimes it operates through legitimate programs and respected institutions. Sometimes the chains are made of visa regulations and financial desperation rather than metal. And sometimes the most dangerous traffickers are those who have mastered the art of exploitation while maintaining perfect suburban respectability. For every dramatic trafficking story on the news, dozens happen in plain sight, behind the manicured hedges of homes you drive past every day. The victims serve your coffee, teach your children, clean your houses, all while living under controls designed to be invisible to outside eye. Their prisons have granite countertops and well-tended gardens. Their jailers are people you might know, might admire, might even envy. That reality is perhaps the most terrifying of all. I was 19 when I won a regional modeling competition in my home state of Nebraska. The prize was a trip to Miami for a national competition that promised exposure to legitimate agencies. As the daughter of a single mother working 2 jobs, this felt like winning the lottery, my ticket out of our small town and into the career I'd dreamed about. This is my story for Realist Quill about how that dream became a nightmare and the harrowing journey back to freedom. The organizer, Victor Lantos, ran what appeared to be a legitimate modeling management company. His social media showcased successful models, fashion show photos, and endorsements from recognizable industry names. When he called personally to congratulate me, explaining how he saw special potential in my look, I was ecstatic. My mother was hesitant,
The competition required contestants to travel without family. But the opportunity seemed too valuable to refuse. "We handle everything," Victor assured us. "Hotel, meals, transportation, even a stipend for incidentals. All our staff are women, and security is our priority." He sent professional-looking contracts, itineraries on company letterhead, and links to social media posts from previous contestants, showing glamorous photo shoots and runway shows. What we didn't notice was that none of those previous contestants had actual modeling careers afterward. They appeared in company materials briefly, then disappeared from the industry entirely. Miami was overwhelming, my first time seeing the ocean, staying in a luxury hotel, being treated like someone important. 25 girls had been selected nationally. We surrendered our phones upon arrival for focus and security purposes, receiving basic flip phones with limited functionality instead. Our accommodations were lavish but strangely isolated, located on a private property rather than in the city proper. The competition's first days seemed legitimate. Professional photographers took our portfolios. Runway coaches critiqued our walks. Makeup artists created different looks, but there were unsettling elements. Our movements were constantly monitored. We weren't allowed to leave the property without escorts, and the promised industry judges never materialized. On the fourth night, everything changed. We were told to prepare for a private showcase, where select industry professionals would evaluate us for potential contracts. The outfits provided were far more revealing than standard runway attire. When several girls objected, they were taken aside for attitude adjustment conversations and returned subdued, oddly compliant. The showcase wasn't held at the convention center listed in our itineraries, but at a sprawling private estate with extensive security. Upon arrival, we were separated into smaller groups and escorted to different areas. My group, 5 girls including myself, was brought to a pool house, converted into a lounge where 8 men waited, none with any visible industry credentials. These gentlemen represent private clients looking for exclusive talent, our handler explained. They're prepared to offer substantial contracts for the right girls. What followed wasn't a professional evaluation, but something closer to an auction. We were instructed to walk, turn, answer personal questions about our backgrounds, our families, our romantic histories. The men discussed us as if we weren't present, commenting on physical attributes, making thinly veiled sexual remarks, asking about our compliance and adaptability. One girl from Idaho broke down crying and was immediately removed. Another from Florida started asking pointed questions about agency affiliations and was also taken away. 3 of us remained, frozen in confusion and mounting fear. As the men began discussing numbers and acquisition terms, my breaking point came when one man approached me directly, running his finger along my collarbone while asking if I had any medical conditions they should know about. Something in his clinical assessment made the situation's reality crystallize with terrifying clarity. This wasn't a modeling competition. It was human appraisal. I backed away, saying I needed the restroom, and was reluctantly allowed to go with a female handler waiting outside. Instead of turning toward the bathrooms, I took a desperate gamble. Through the main house, past startled staff, out toward what looked like a service entrance. Behind me, I heard shouts, the handler calling for security. The estate was gated, monitored, designed specifically to prevent exactly what I was attempting. But adrenaline and terror are powerful motivators. I scaled a decorative trellis alongside the garage, scraping my hands raw, and managed to reach the perimeter wall. Below was a steep drop to a service road, far enough to cause serious injury. I jumped anyway. The impact was brutal. My ankle twisted. Something cracked in my wrist, but survival instinct pushed me forward. I limped along the road until reaching the main highway, where I flagged down a passing car, an elderly couple, who initially seemed reluctant to stop for a disheveled girl in revealing clothing, but eventually pulled over. They didn't believe my incoherent story about trafficking and modeling competitions, but they did believe I was in genuine distress. They took me to a hospital rather than police. A decision that possibly saved my life given what I later learned about Victor's law enforcement connections in the area. At the hospital, a nurse recognized the signs of trafficking attempt and contacted a specialized unit. Within hours, I was in protective custody, giving statements to FBI agents who explained that the modeling competition was a known recruitment front. Victor Lantos wasn't even his real name. He was Vitaly Kuznetsov, a mid-level operative in an international trafficking network specializing in providing exclusive merchandise to wealthy clients worldwide. The investigation revealed horrifying detail. The 25 regional winners had been carefully selected based on isolation factors. Girls from single-parent homes, economically disadvantaged backgrounds, limited social connections, and strong ambitions that made us vulnerable to exploitation. Our social media had been monitored for months before selection, building psychological profiles to determine who would be most compliant under pressure. The other girls from my group weren't so fortunate. By the time authorities raided the estate, most contestants had been moved. 3 were recovered during subsequent operations in Atlanta and New York. 7 more were traced to overseas locations but couldn't be recovered due to jurisdictional issues and corruption. The remaining 14, including both girls who had been removed from my showcase group, vanished completely. The attitude adjustment I witnessed was later confirmed to involve both psychological intimidation and drugging. The private showcase was the final evaluation before girls were distributed to buyers who had already reviewed our profiles and placed preliminary bids. Some were destined for sexual exploitation in private clubs and residences. Others, particularly those with the right look and education level, were being acquired as trophies and status symbols for wealthy collectors, modern slaves presented as girlfriends, assistants, or companions. The aftermath was almost as traumatic as the escape. During the investigation, I received death threats. My mother had to relocate for safety. I spent months in therapy dealing with guilt over the girls I couldn't help, the ones who disappeared while I ran. The legal process dragged on for years as authorities tried to dismantle the network's extensive operations across multiple countries. Vitaly Kuznetsov eventually received a 30-year sentence, not nearly enough for the lives he destroyed. Several associates received lesser sentences through plea agreements. But the buyers, the wealthy men who created the demand, largely escaped consequences, protected by money, influence, and jurisdictional challenges. 8 years later, I still check my rearview mirror obsessively. I still use a pseudonym on all social media. I still wake up from nightmares about what would have happened if I hadn't run that night, or if I had fallen differently during my escape and been unable to move. The physical injuries healed long ago. The psychological ones remain. I share this story through Realist Quill because the trafficking world has evolved beyond the stereotypical scenarios most people imagine. Today's predators use legitimate appearing businesses, competitions, and opportunities as hunting ground. They create elaborate facades, websites, social media presences, testimonials, all designed to overcome natural caution. They target not just the desperate, but the ambitious, not just the vulnerable, but the talented. They understand that hope is as powerful a lure as necessity. Somewhere right now, another competition is accepting applications. Another opportunity seems too good to refuse. Another young person is being selected based on their isolation factors and psychological profile. The most terrifying part isn't how many people are taken through these methods. It's how perfect the disguise has become, and how completely normal everything appears until the moment the mask finally drops. When Hurricane Eliza devastated Puerto Rico in 2022, I was 27 and working as an emergency room nurse in Chicago. The images of destruction compelled me to help, so I signed up with Global Relief Action, a disaster response organization recruiting medical professionals for 3-month deployments. This is my story for Realist Quill about how humanitarian instincts led me straight into a trafficking operation, masquerading as disaster relief, and the systemic failures that allowed it to happen. My credentials were verified quickly. Nursing license, certifications, passport, medical history. GRI's website showcased previous missions in Haiti, the Philippines, and other disaster zones. Their social profiles featured testimonials from doctors and nurses who had served with them. Everything about the organization appeared professional and legitimate. The first warning sign should have been the rushed deployment. Just 4 days after applying, I was on a charter flight with 20 other volunteers, mostly medical staff, but also engineers, logistics specialists, and interpreters. We were told the expedited process was due to the dire conditions on the ground. With people dying for lack of basic care, normal protocols were being streamlined. Upon landing in San Juan, instead of coordinating with FEMA or established relief agencies, we were taken directly to what GRI called their forward operating base in the mountainous interior, where damage was most severe. The compound was isolated but well equipped: generators, satellite communications, prefabricated structures for housing and medical facilities. Dr. Marcus Reed, GRI's field director, explained that we'd be treating patients in surrounding communities where established infrastructure had collapsed. We would rotate between the base clinic and mobile medical teams traveling to remote villages. The situation seemed urgent but organized. We were issued GRI credentials, uniforms, and equipment packs. For the first 2 weeks, everything functioned as expected. We treated hundreds of patients daily: dehydration, injuries, chronic conditions exacerbated by medication shortages. The work was exhausting but fulfilling. We were genuinely helping people in desperate need. Then came subtle shifts. Our satellite phones were collected for system updates and never returned. Team rotations to San Juan for supply runs became less frequent. Communications with the outside world were increasingly funneled through Reed's office with explanations about bandwidth limitations and security protocols. I began noticing discrepancies in our pharmacy supplies. Medications were arriving that didn't match our requisition lists. Unusual quantities of sedatives, opioids, and fertility drugs, with no clear disaster relief application. When I questioned this, Dr. Reed explained they were preparing for secondary medical needs as the situation evolved. Most disturbing was the changing patient population. Initially, we treated everyone: the elderly, children, men and women equally, but gradually, our mobile clinics began focusing almost exclusively on young women and adolescent girls, particularly those from more isolated communities where Spanish wasn't the primary language. The turning point came during my 3rd week. I was assigned to a mobile team traveling to a remote mountain village that had supposedly requested medical assistance. Upon arrival, instead of the usual community gathering, we were directed to evaluate specific young women who had been pre-selected by our advanced team. Rather than treating existing conditions, we were conducting what amounted to physical assessments, documenting heights, weights, physical development, and reproductive history. When I questioned the team leader about this protocol deviation, he responded with rehearsed lines about population health studies and long-term disaster planning. But his eyes wouldn't meet mine, and the girls being examined showed signs of fear rather than relief at receiving medical attention. That evening, I overheard Reed speaking with someone via satellite phone about processing the first shipment and quality merchandise that would clear medical screening. He mentioned buyers in Dominican Republic and transit arrangements to Miami. The clinical detachment in his voice as he discussed human beings chilled me to the core. I needed to verify my suspicions before acting. The next day, I volunteered for inventory duty and gained access to the supply tent, where I discovered boxes of blank passports, visa stamps, and document printing equipment alongside the medical supply. Hidden behind pharmaceutical crates were sedatives packaged in individual doses with Spanish instructions for compliant transportation. What I'd stumbled upon wasn't a relief operation, but a sophisticated trafficking network using disaster conditions as cover. The legitimate medical work we performed in the early weeks established our credibility with local communities. The isolation created by the hurricane provided perfect conditions for identifying vulnerable targets: young women from impoverished areas where family members might have been displaced or killed, where normal protective systems had collapsed. That night, I approached Elena, our logistics coordinator, who had seemed increasingly uncomfortable with recent assignments. Behind closed doors, she confirmed my fears. GRA wasn't registered with any legitimate international relief coordinating body. The organization appeared and disappeared after major disasters, always operating just beyond the reach of established agencies. She had noticed similar patterns during her previous deployment, but had dismissed her concerns as paranoia. Together, we documented everything we could: medication inventories, patient selection patterns, overhead conversations. We couldn't risk using the compound's communication systems, so we needed to get physical evidence out through other channels. Our opportunity came 2 days later when a supply run to San Juan was scheduled. Elena manipulated the roster to place me on the team, and we carefully hid our documentation in medical supply packaging. The 6-hour journey was excruciating, maintaining normal conversation with team members who might or might not be complicit, wondering if our amateur evidence gathering had been detected. In San Juan, breaking away from the group required perfect timing. During a supply pickup at a hospital, I slipped away through an employee exit, leaving behind everything except my identification and our evidence. I made my way to the FBI field office, where my initial reception was skeptical at best. The agent interviewing me clearly questioned whether this was a case of misinterpreted humanitarian work by an overwhelmed volunteer. What saved my credibility was a nurse practitioner from Delaware who had quit GRA 3 days earlier with similar concern. She had filed a report that hadn't yet been actioned. The combination of our testimonies and physical evidence triggered a jurisdictional nightmare but eventual intervention.
The raid on the compound occurred 5 days after my escape. By then, significant evidence had been destroyed, and several key personnel, including Dr. Reed, had disappeared. 17 staff members were detained, though many claimed they were legitimate volunteers, unaware of the trafficking operations. Most disturbing were the 34 young women and girls found in various stages of processing. Some sedated, some with partially completed documentation for transport to the Dominican Republic. The investigation revealed that Global Relief Action was one of 3 identities used by the same criminal network, which established operations following major disasters in multiple countries. The chaos of disaster zones provided perfect cover, limited law enforcement, disrupted communications, desperate populations, and the ability to move people across borders under the guise of medical evacuations or family reunification. They specifically recruited credentialed professionals like myself to establish legitimacy. Most volunteers were indeed legitimate and unaware of the operation's true purpose. They maintained operational security by compartmentalizing information. Medical teams treated patients, but weren't involved in patient transport. Logistics teams handled supplies but weren't involved in special inventories. Elena wasn't so fortunate. She disappeared during the chaos of the raid. 6 months later, her body was discovered in a shallow grave near the compound. She had been executed with a single gunshot, likely immediately after our escape plan was discovered. The federal investigation identified connections to trafficking networks across Central America, the Caribbean, and Southern Europe. The operation's sophistication was staggering. They had inserted people into legitimate disaster response agencies to monitor deployment patterns and identify opportunities. They had established shell companies to handle medical supply procurement, keeping actual trafficking operations at arm's length from detectable financial transactions. Of the 27 people eventually indicted, only 18 faced trial. The others, including Reed and the organization's founders, remain fugitives, likely operating under new identities in new disaster zones. Of those convicted, the sentences averaged just 12 years, inadequate for the scale of human suffering they had caused. I spent the next 18 months assisting investigations and prosecutions before being placed in a limited witness protection program. My nursing career was effectively over. I couldn't risk working in settings where my identity could be verified against professional licenses. The PTSD from those 3 weeks in Puerto Rico has been debilitating at times. Survivor's guilt haunts me, particularly about Elena and the unknown number of women who were trafficked before the operation was discovered. What terrifies me most isn't the individuals who ran this operation,
It's the system that allowed it to function. The disaster response community lacks effective verification mechanisms for new organizations. Overwhelmed local authorities readily accept help without thorough background checks during crises. The chaos of natural disasters creates perfect conditions for predators to operate alongside legitimate humanitarians, often indistinguishable from them. I tell this story through Realist Quill because as climate change increases the frequency and severity of natural disasters, these trafficking operations will find more opportunities to exploit chaos and desperation. The next hurricane, earthquake, or flood will bring both genuine relief workers and predators wearing the same uniforms, driving the same vehicles, offering the same promises of help. The most sophisticated trafficking operations don't look like trafficking at all. They mimic legitimate systems so perfectly that victims walk voluntarily into capture, helpers become unwitting accomplices, and authorities struggle to distinguish between rescue and exploitation until it's too late. In the aftermath of disaster, when systems are broken and people are at their most vulnerable, the line between savior and predator becomes dangerously thin. So the next time disaster strikes and new organizations appear offering help, remember this story. Remember that the most dangerous wolves wear the most convincing sheep's clothing. And remember that sometimes the people who come to rescue can instead become the most terrifying danger of all.
You know, I never thought I'd be sitting here telling this story. When you hear about human trafficking on the news, you always think that happens to other people, until it almost happens to you. I was just starting out as a model back in 22 years old, fresh out of college with student loans breathing down my neck. And this photographer reaches out on Instagram. Said he'd seen my amateur portfolio and thought I had the look for this big European fashion campaign he was scouting for. I should have seen the red flags. The way he insisted we meet at this remote studio instead of somewhere public. How he dodged questions about his agency credentials. But I was young, I was desperate, and most importantly, I was naive enough to believe this could be my big break. The day of the photo shoot, I texted my roommate the address just in case. Thank God I did. The studio turned out to be this abandoned warehouse about an hour outside the city. There were 3 men there, not just the photographer I'd been talking to. One blocked the exit as soon as I walked in. That's when I knew. This wasn't about modeling. This wasn't about photos. This was about making me disappear. They took my phone, but not before I managed to hit send on an SOS text to my roommate. The photographer kept talking about how much money I was going to make them overseas. How I should just cooperate and things would be easier for me. All while the other 2 started setting up what looked like some kind of makeshift processing center. Taking photos of me against a white wall. Measuring my height. I remember standing there trying not to shake, trying not to cry, because something in me knew that showing fear would only make things worse. Instead, I focused on memorizing their faces, listening for names, looking for any detail that might help later if I somehow got out. 3 hours in, I heard sirens. At first, the men didn't seem concerned. This wasn't exactly a neighborhood where police were uncommon. But when they got closer, instead of fading away, I saw panic flash across the photographer's face. They started packing up quickly, arguing about what to do with me. One wanted to take me and run. Another said to leave me. The photographer just kept saying, "We're dead if we don't make this delivery." That's when I realized how disposable I was to them. Just a delivery. When the police burst through the door, the men scattered like cockroaches. 2 made it out the back, but they caught the photographer. Turns out my roommate had called 911 immediately after getting my text. And thank God she did. The police later told me they'd found sedatives and restraints in their van parked outside. They had international connections, fake passports ready. I was hours away from being trafficked overseas. The scariest part? The photographer wasn't some sketchy criminal you'd cross the street to avoid. He was well-dressed, articulate, could have been anyone's neighbor or coworker. He knew exactly what to say to make young women trust him. He told the police he'd recruited 8 other girls before me, and none of them were ever found. Sometimes I still check my social media messages 3 or 4 times before responding to anyone new. I had to quit modeling altogether.
couldn't handle the anxiety, but I consider myself one of the lucky ones. I got to come home that night. I got to keep my freedom. I got to keep my light. And I tell this story now, through Realist Quill, because maybe it'll save someone else from making the same mistake I did. Because the monsters trafficking humans don't look like monsters at all. They look like opportunity knocking, and they're counting on your desperation to open that door.
My mother always warned me that if something sounds too good to be true, it probably is. I should have remembered that when I saw the job listing for resort staff in the Bahamas. Full accommodations, great pay, flight included. Perfect for a broke college graduate like me trying to figure out what to do with my life. The recruitment process seemed legitimate. Video interviews, reference checks, documentation. The woman handling my application, Diane, was professional, prompt with her responses, motherly even. Told me I reminded her of her daughter. Looking back, that should have been another red flag. The flight was booked for me. I was told someone would pick me up at the airport. And someone did. A man named Carlos with a sign bearing my name. But instead of going to a resort, we drove for hours deep into areas with no tourists, no hotels, nothing but increasingly rural surroundings and my growing sense of dread. I asked where we were going. Carlos said there was a processing center for new employees. I asked to call the resort. My phone had no signal. I asked to stop for a bathroom break, thinking I might find help. Carlos refused. That's when I knew I was in serious trouble. We arrived at a compound with high walls and several small buildings. Not a resort, not even close. There were other young women there, from different countries. None speaking much above a whisper, all looking shell-shocked. Guards at every exit. They took my passport, my phone, everything. Said I owed them for the flight, for housing, for food, debts I'd have to work off. The work became clear when they brought in the men who looked us over like livestock. I was being sold into sexual slavery. My family had no idea where I really was. That first night, I overheard two guards talking about moving the merchandise to another location the following day. I realized if I was going to escape, it had to be now, before I disappeared completely. There was a small window in the bathroom with rusted bar. Over the next hours, I worked one loose while pretending to be ill so they'd leave me alone. By midnight, I'd created an opening barely big enough to squeeze through. The compound had dogs. I'd seen them patrolling, so I did the only thing I could think of. I soaked myself in cleaning chemicals from the bathroom to mask my scent. The ammonia burned my skin, but the alternative was unthinkable. I ran for miles through unfamiliar terrain, hiding whenever I heard vehicle. By dawn, I reached a main road and flagged down a local fisherman heading to market. I couldn't speak the language, but terror is universal. He understood enough to take me to the police. The aftermath was almost as horrific as the experience. Embassy involvement, statement, identification attempts, finding out that Diane didn't exist. The resort job was fiction. The recruitment company's website disappeared within hours of my escape. The compound was abandoned by the time authorities arrived. 3 other women escaped with information I provided. Dozens more were never found. An international trafficking ring scattered like smoke. 5 years later, I still wake up sweating from nightmares about what would have happened if I hadn't escaped that first night. About the women who weren't as lucky. About how easily my life nearly ended while my family thought I was living my dream job. This is why I share my story through Realist Quill. Because somewhere right now, someone is looking at a too-good-to-be-true job opportunity. And maybe, just maybe, they'll remember my story and look a little deeper before they end up somewhere they can't escape from. I've been a long-haul trucker for almost 15 years now, and I've seen plenty of strange things on America's highways. But nothing compares to what happened at this little truck stop off I-40 in the middle of nowhere, New Mexico. It was around 2 a.m., that dead time of night when everything feels a little unreal. I'd pulled in to fuel up and grab some coffee. Place was mostly empty, just a couple other trucks and a beat-up van parked way at the back of the lot. I was heading back to my rig when I heard it, a faint tapping coming from inside the van. Could have ignored it. Should have ignored it.
Probably. But something about that tapping sound raised the hair on my neck. I walked over, coffee still in hand, and that's when I saw her. A young woman's face in the window, eyes wide with panic. She mouthed something I couldn't make out. Then she held up her hands, zip-tied together. My first instinct was to call 911. But before I could even reach for my phone, two men came out of the truck stop. One was carrying snacks, casual as can be. The other locked eyes with me standing by their van, and his whole demeanor changed in an instant. They quickened their pace. I pretended I was just passing by, nodded to them like everything was normal, and walked back to my truck. Called 911 the second I got inside. But I knew the response time out here would be 30 minutes minimum. While I was on the phone, I watched them through my mirror. They were arguing, gesturing at the van. Then they both got in and started the engine. They were going to leave, and that woman was going with them. I've never considered myself a hero. I'm just a guy who drives truck. But in that moment, I knew if I didn't do something, that woman was as good as dead. So I did the only thing I could think of. I positioned my rig to block the exit. They couldn't get around me without going off-road, which that van wasn't built for. The driver laid on the horn, then got out and started toward my truck. I could see the rage in his face, even from a distance. What he didn't see was that I was still on the phone with 911. What I didn't see was his partner circling around the other side with what looked like a tire iron. The next few minutes were chaos. The first guy tried to pull me out of my cab, while the second one swung at me through the passenger window. I managed to hold the door shut against the first guy, but the second one shattered my window. That's when we heard it. Sirens in the distance. Both men froze for a split second, then ran back to their... They tried to maneuver around my truck by going off-road, but just as I'd figured, their van got stuck in the soft shoulder. When the police arrived, they found 3 women in that van, all drugged, all bound, all being transported from Arizona to Texas to be sold. One of them had been missing for 6 months. Another had been taken just 2 days earlier. The officers told me later that this was part of a trafficking pipeline moving women across state line. The truck stop was a regular transfer point. The traffickers thought they'd blend in with all the other vehicles coming and going at odd hours. I gave my statement, helped how I could, and was back on the road by noon. Tried to go back to my normal routine, but I haven't been able to shake what almost happened that night. How close those women came to disappearing forever. How many others didn't get so lucky. Every truck stop I pull into now, I look a little closer at the vehicles around me. Listen a little harder for sounds that don't belong. Because the scariest thing about that night wasn't the traffickers themselves. It was realizing how invisible their victims are, moving right through our world in plain sight. That's why I'm sharing this story with REALIST, because sometimes the difference between someone being saved and someone disappearing forever is just one person paying attention when something doesn't feel right.